We will try to debate in depth within the framework of less than an hour an issue that is so expansive that LVLVLF will spend the rest of the year working about it, and I'm sure that the Belgian government has very interesting plans that will be revealed right here for you as well. Let's hope. So anyway, just to start up the debate, I would like to refer back to the very interesting introductory lecture or introduction that was given by François Crépeau. And I would like to take a few short reminders of what was being said and ask the panel to respond to that. So I exclude you from responding to your own statements, briefly. If you disagree with what you said before, you will have to have a real explanation. Now, the first thing that maybe I would like to throw up as a point of debate is when François Crépeau said earlier this afternoon, states should take over the mobility market. I thought it was one of the important positions that you took. There is a lot of mobility happening. By creating these strong fences, we create actually an underground economy of transmission, of mobility, and it's better that states would take over that market. I will give the minister just a second to reflect because he wasn't there when it was stated. Elene, would you agree that states have to do that? Because basically that is what the Philippine government has been doing, organizing mobility from the government for the Filipinos. Do you think that governments should organize mobility?
Well, maybe the term is because, as you said, take over, and it's not something that I'm comfortable with. But I think the role of government is to make sure that mobility, the role of government is to facilitate the mobility. I think that was also the message of Francois this in his keynote. Yeah. It should facilitate, and by facilitate, it should mean making it more easy, maybe less costly, and this is maybe the role that the state should do, and not, put a barrier wherein it will result to underground, more informality, undocumented migration. Yeah.
Bogdan, can we avoid the barriers? Is that the role that government should do away with borders and barriers? Is that what François meant?
I don't think he meant that. I mean, I think borders are important, and you can see who comes at your border. But if you face a lot of people trying to come in, or if you face a crisis, I think it's important to manage the crisis. And managing the crisis means that you create ways of traveling from one place to another place and to control it. So it's one of the things we will ask in our campaign. I think the organization who's co-organizing here, Vluchtelingenwerk Vlaanderen, has been saying that for a long time. We need legal ways of traveling and giving ways to migrants to legally come over here, so you can control it. You can manage it. It's very important, I think.
Yeah. Mr. De Croo, should states organize mobility in the way that is being talked about?
Well, I'm now the third one trying to interpret what has been said. The way I understand it is that if there are sufficient legal ways for mobility, in one way, this will impact the illegal ways of mobility. And that I agree with. I think that people's mobility is something that has always existed. It's something of humankind, and I can expect that it will continue in our humankind. Does that mean that states have to organize it physically, operate themselves? I do not think that was being said. I think that you need to create a framework where that can happen, and where it can happen in a legal way, where it can happen in a traceable way, and where it can happen in a safe way. And obviously, a big part of the illegal movement that you see is taking place, because it's just very hard to do it on a legal basis.
But what we see, especially in Europe the past years, is that governments, instead of creating a legal framework for mobility, are trying to stop the unregulated movement of people. But repression seems to be maybe not the only, but the main answer.
But if you look at, and I guess this topic will be discussed in any case, is the Turkey deal. There's different perspectives to that. I know that some people say that you cannot make a deal with Turkey today because of what is happening from a human rights perspective in Turkey. And I would definitely agree that the human rights evolution in Turkey it's not even worrying, it is dramatic. But if you look at it from a refugee perspective, and really isolating the refugee perspective, the Turkey deal has worked. The number of people drowning in the Mediterranean has drastically diminished.
Or
and
shifted.
It was, well, but the idea was to create a mechanism of regular migration and asylum with resettlements and so on. And we can have a discussion on have the things that were promised, were they actually implemented. But this type of agreement between Europe and Turkey is, I think, from a refugee perspective, it was a step forward. And to maybe put it completely bluntly, if you are a refugee who is drowning in the Mediterranean, a discussion about human rights might seem a bit a discussion that is far away, because at that moment you are drowning and you would want to avoid to be in a position where you are drowning. So I wouldn't say that from a political perspective it has only been about closing doors and not offering an alternative.
Well, there hasn't been much of an alternative being realized. I mean, in the deal there was promise of resettlement, and basically it was not about avoiding people drowning because they were walking into Europe through the Balkans. That was what the deal was more about. Anyway, the resettlement didn't quite happen much.
I agree that from a resettlement perspective, not everything was achieved. And very often then you would say, well, then if you look at the Belgian situation, you didn't do a lot of them, and it's true. But of course you have to look at it, I would not look at in isolation and just point at resettlement. If you look at a position like a country like Belgium, well, you cannot say that we didn't do our fair share. We did actually much more than our fair share on the asylum part, and I defend it. I think we should do it. And if you look at investments that we have done in trying to improve the circumstances in refugee camps in Turkey and the region and so on, I think we've done way more than our fair share. I think the problem is that the step between making plans and an agreement on resettlement and then executing it and holding every European country accountable in executing it, well, that hasn't worked perfectly. That's true. Yeah.
To put it mildly. Francois first, and then we'll go to Elena.
It seems the audio installation is criticizing me.
No, it's just biased, as we all are. Francois, just to stay on the EU-Turkey deal, would you see that as an example of what you were proposing of managing and taking state responsibility in the mobility of people in migration flows?
I would say it would be if it was part of a much bigger plan. In terms of resettlement, I think that Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand could have offered to resettle 500,000 people per year. Oops, thank you. 500,000 people per year. And this was, if this had been done, the numbers for each of the countries of the global north would have been pretty small. A country like, if we take 500,000 only for Europe, for a 500 million continent, it's 1 per 1,000. So a country like Belgium, which has 12 million inhabitants? 11. would have 11,000 refugees to take per year. That's a small number. Germany would have 80,000 or 83,000 or something. It's a small number as compared to the million they took 2 years back. This has to be linked also with the mobility options, the pathways for low-skilled workers whom we need and whom we don't acknowledge as labor needs, since we keep entertaining in all of our countries, not simply Belgium or Canada, all of our countries have underground labor markets that we're not keen to change because we benefit from lower labor costs. And so it has to be a much bigger plan. An EU-Turkey plan alone is not enough.
But you could build on it, or would you say we should replace it altogether?
Well, is there a political will for doing better? And that's, I'm not sure there is at the moment. We're facing a nationalist populist bump, and in many of our countries, I don't think there's much political will, much appetite for risking losing elections on what will be certainly attacked by the nationalist populist as being irresponsible, unfeasible, whatever, etc. But I think that there will have to be, at one point, maybe after the bump, we'll see, there will have to be a much bigger plan where we create mobility options for most migrants. And when those mobility options will be in place, be they student visas, retirement visas, work visas, looking for work visas, etc., when this is in place and people are allowed to circulate, move on a regular basis, sometimes waiting for 6 months because the quota for the 6 months is up and then you have to wait, but people will wait. People don't want to be undocumented or to have very precarious work status. They want to have long-term possibilities, which may or may not materialize after a while.
Elena, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah. Just to go back to what Francois mentioned in his presentation about the push and the pull factors. So from the country of origin, you have structural problems, the lack of decent jobs, question of development, etc. But then there is the pull factor, that the migrants are needed. There is acute shortage of workers. There are certain sections of the economies that would need workers, care work, housework, that locals do not want to take on. So they go because there is jobs. So I think it's very important to emphasize that they do not cross the borders just because they do not have jobs in the Philippines. It takes a lot of effort and money and time to be able to process your documents and to get the job. So you have an employer, you have a contract, and this where this idea of a worker is a worker. And yet, when it applies to migrant workers, these fundamental rights at work don't seem to be applied equally to the migrant workers. And then I would also add that for the migrant workers, as I said in our plenary, in our session, they do not go home at the end of a day's work to the comforts of their homes and their families. They go home to the accommodation in Saudi or in Qatar. It's not normal that for 2 years or extended period of time, you are separated from Villa. So it's not like we are excited to have that situation. I was talking to a group of young students in France, very far from Paris, and they are like, oh, then maybe the Filipinos will come to France. So I said, well, maybe we want to, just to see the Eiffel Tower, but it's going to be very difficult. We don't speak the language. Your immigration is closed. And what are the jobs that are waiting for us? So, I mean, it's two-way. Yeah. It's the one more message. The migrant workers are the guarantors that the work that is needed in the country of destination go or proceed uninterrupted. Yeah. And I think that is something that we must tell. This is good news. It's not bad news.
Yeah. So just one more point that I would like to pick up from the introduction, and actually we've already entered the debate that was more profound than the opening salvo in a sense. But another quote that I would like to raise is, democracy cannot represent foreigners, meaning non-citizens, people who are not voters. It's an important question, I think, to tackle, because that goes to the heart of the question: how will we change policies in terms of migration, of migrants, and of general diversity in our own countries, but also across borders? So, Bogdan, from a civil society perspective, you're actually paid to change the policies of the country. How do you tackle this problem? Because it is real. Democracy is representing citizens, and those who are outside of that scope have very little voice in it.
Yes, I of course recognize the analysis of Monsieur Crépeau, because we have the same problem in, let's say, the classical development cooperation. The people that benefit from the money that is being freed by our government, the 0.7% that we want, they are also not represented here. And if, for example, the budgets go down or we do something wrong in that department, it is not going to be punished by the voters. So it's actually the same problem. And I think the answer...
It's not if, it is when. I mean, the budget is going down.
Yes. And it's an easy, it's easier to cut for development cooperation than to cut in social security. I think that's a fact, because you don't get punished by voters. So I think the solution, and it was almost almost given also by Mr. Crépeau, is that other organizations should represent the people in the South that have the problems when budget cuts come. And that's actually something that we as civil society must do. And I think the same goes up for migrants in the short term. And I think in the presentation of Mr. Crépeau, there were several things. There were the artists, civil society, trade unions, business corporations. So I think a lot of people can play their role within civil society and defend the right of migration and these things. On the long term, I think there need to be a better representation. I think there need to be a better representation. But if I look at my own city where I live, in Antwerp, and I look at my generation, I'm 45. And when I went to school, first migrants came in. I still remember that when I was in school. My children, they are in schools with 40 or 50% of migrants and people with other backgrounds. So I hope, and I think you said it as well, that migration and diverse societies become more normal in my children's head than it is in mine. And that's, I think, on the long term, something we can hope for.
Is it true, Minister De Croo, that people who are not citizens are not represented and therefore easy to pass by when legislation or when policies are made? Are they in any way enough represented in our democracies?
Let me just, and I will answer your question, do not worry. But first on one inconvenient truth. The development cooperation budget increased. It's something that some people do not want to hear. But if you look at the budget of what we spent in
ODA
2000,
budget.
and if you look at what we spent in 2016 and you compare it to 2015, it increased. Now, some people will say, yes, it increased because of asylum expenses. Well, that is only 1/3 of the increase. So 1/3 of the increase is coming from asylum expenses, which is true. But 2/3 of the increase is regular development cooperation budget. So I just wanted to take this opportunity because it has become commonplace to always say there's budget cuts, but in practice, it's not the case. Now, are we at 0.7%? I agree we are not, but we are at European average. And if you look at where we spend our money and our priorities in the least developed countries, there we are going radically against the trend. Most countries decrease their funds in least developed countries. We are one of the countries that increase it, and there's not that many. I just wanted to take that opportunity because I do not get often the opportunity to answer that.
Just
Now,
before you go on to answer my question, this increase, is that on your budget or is it ODA? Just for everybody to have the whole information.
Well,
Because
so-
your budget is only part of the ODA allotted budget of the Belgian government.
Well, that's what I said. So a part of the ODA is asylum
Yeah.
expenses. And so the increase of our ODA, 1/3 of the increase is indeed coming from increased asylum expenses, but 2/3 is coming from increased development expenses, basically what you would call my budget.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you for
I
the
feel you will
clarification.
write an article on this.
I'm
Or
quite
maybe
sure.
not. But on your question on representation, I think that our democracy is much more elaborate than just saying, look, since you do not have a voting right, you don't have influence. That's not how it works, I have felt. You have people who are concerned about the refugee topic. You have people who think it is something that should be made, that mobility should be made more easy. You have people who have opposite ideas on that. So saying that just closing borders, closing the doors is easy because the people that you keep out are not going to vote, I do not think it's really that easy. And we have talked about the nationalist tendencies and so on. Until a few months ago, I would have thought, indeed, it is a slippery slope, and the slippery slope is only going down. I've never been completely convinced of that, and more I see that the idea that this is, the domino stones are falling. Well, we've seen that some domino stones have fallen, but some of them have not. And I'm not convinced that we are just going in one direction and there's no way back. What you see is that there are opposite voices, and those opposite voices gain traction, and that's a good thing. And it's not easy, because it's not easy to bring a moderate message in times where you basically have 140 characters to bring them. Yeah. But you see that some people manage actually to do that. And so I'm not so negative on that. Now,
representation.
On the representation itself, look, the issue, of course, is that migration, that the thoughts around migration have been contaminated by a few things over the last years. There have been regular organized migration has been contaminated by irregular migration. And obviously, as I said before, there's a link between one and the other. Migration has also been contaminated by the whole terror discussion. Now, in practice, there's almost no link between one and the other, but that's the case today. So I would rather, let's cool things down and get into a rational, not too emotional discussion about migration first, and we'll take a next step afterwards.
Eleni.
Yeah, on the issue of participation, I think this is also an issue for the countries of origin, because many of the migrants, when they cross the borders, they are denied their right to participate in their own elections. So in the case of the Philippines, it took us 16 years to lobby Congress for the passage of the overseas voting law. And the turnout isn't very impressive as yet. But this is something that should not be taken away just because they cross the borders. There have been platforms in various government agencies where migrants can sit. So this is part of the participation. In the country of destination, of course, we continue to challenge that if you pay your taxes, contribute, etc., then eventually, especially for countries where paths to citizenship are open, then eventually they will be allowed to vote, even if they have not achieved complete full citizenship. I think there are already countries doing that. But at the same time, where they cannot vote as yet, there are other platforms that we can definitely pave the way open for the migrants' voices to be heard. In the case of Hong Kong, they have this council where migrants are allowed to sit. and be heard in policy issues that impact on their lives as migrants in those countries. So I think for us as advocates, we just continue to challenge this because, of course, the takeoff is the world is already divided into nation states, and then suddenly you're going back to this issue of migration when everything has settled down already. You continue to challenge. These things are not cast in stones.
Yeah. Okay, let me put it one step further and talk further about policy, because if we think about how we can make migration a centerpiece of human development, or at least use migration or make the contribution of migrants a way of developing globally, not just through remittances, help their countries where they have their families, but also, as Eleni already said, develop and build literally the countries where they migrate to. There are many ways that migration and development are connected and interwoven in a sense. But what kind of policies do we need to make that happen, to maximize the potential of migration in terms of development? And maybe I've been asking you to react, Minister. Let me ask you to propose. What would you say is a priority that in policy terms could make a difference in this respect?
Well, I think first of all, one of the issues you see today is that why do you have such chaotic and irregular migration is that in general for migration, public authorities play a certain role. Here in Europe, public authorities play a certain role, but today the absence of public authority in some countries is a big issue. The fact that, for example, in Libya you have almost no state system is making things very, very difficult. The fact that in some of the Sahel countries and parts of these countries the public authority is gone is problematic because it creates a space for people smugglers, and the space for people smugglers is dragging people into something which they actually don't know what they might be getting into. So any investment that you do in what you would call peace and security, stabilizing countries, fighting crime in these countries are, I think, very positive developments. And very often we would say the Sustainable Development Goals, the big new element in the Sustainable Development Goals is the focus on the private sector. I'm not so sure. I think the idea of private sector development is not so new. I think the fact that peace and security is incorporated in the Sustainable Development Goals is a new thing. And
how do you avoid, when you look at that, how do you avoid that slipping into Western interventionism that actually created the chaos in Libya in the first place?
Well, okay, there you're making a jump in thoughts. I think that very often, this is about creating a public system where you have law enforcement that is fair to people and not abusing law enforcement for one political ideology, where you have a military force that is schooled, that knows how to work, where you have a migration administration. It's one of the things in our development work that we do with Morocco today is building together with them an administration for regular migration, because Morocco today is actually a country that is also getting a lot of influx, migration influx. All these things is about creating the necessary infrastructural laws, civil rights space, and so on to organize a performing state. Look, most people know I'm a liberal. It's not because I'm a liberal that I think there's no role for the state. I mean, a state has a certain role to play, and related to migration, I think it's quite normal.
But is it control or is it care also? I mean, a performing state can mean many different things.
A performing state, for me, is not a totalitarian repressive state. that was what you were
I
pointing
would
to.
not infer that. But
Not at all. If you want migration to work, you need to have an organized system to make this work. If you want to make it possible in a legal way, well, you need to have a legal system in a certain in a country. So that domain, it is maybe not the most visually sexy domain of development cooperation, but it is a very important one. As much as domestic resource mobilization is one, to make sure that countries have their own means and can have policy with their own means. I think besides that, and now I come to the private sector part, there's been a lot of talking over the last decades about circular migration, and up to now it's been quite hard to do it. I think that today we live in times where it should be much easier to do it today, because technology helps it. Because, and you talked about remittances, it's a complete disgrace today, the cost of remittances, and there is no reason that it should be so expensive. And it is something where in our Belgian work we will be focusing on, together with the diaspora, together with the sector, on getting those costs down. And just in general, because physically and technologically, people moving around is much easier. What you feel is that in the private sector, there is now a genuine interest in circular migration. More and more, we see people coming to us and say, we want to do this, but today it looks like the doors are closed. And circular migration could be something that spurs a gigantic ideological debate. Maybe we just need to avoid the ideological debates and do something which is very often used in the technological sphere, is to say, well, let's create a sandbox. Let's create a controlled environment where we test it out. Instead of discussing 10 years about it, let's just create a few use cases where it can be done with a few private sector entities who are willing to do it, and let's see if it works. And if it does work, then you can scale it up.
Francois, maybe you come in here and give us an idea what you think would be necessary conditions for circular migration to work in a dignified way so that it helps the migrants, their families, and nations across the continents. Why is it not working until now? And what is needed to make it work? If the minister wants a sandbox, how should that look like?
That's many questions.
Try one answer.
First, you mentioned dignity. For all of us, dignity can be expressed in many ways, but including this way, dignity is about the ability to exercise options, to have choices, and to make choices for ourselves. I think the dignity of migrants is to offer them choices. And I think that is why the idea of increasing considerably over time the options in terms of visa facilitation, visa liberalization, the number of visas, the different possibilities, non-visa options, etc., offering circular options, but also offering more open options. I mean, this is what should be expanded considerably over time, so that people can choose. People can choose to go and come. What, in the long term, what Europe has organized for itself in terms of free movement of people, and we have seen that there hasn't been an outpouring of people from one country to the next. The average on Earth about migration, and it's a relatively constant proportion, is 3%. 3% of the world population at present, 3.1 now, is migrant. And to me, this is so the fear that there will be an outpouring is, on the short term, there will be a bump, possibly, but on the long term, it's not sustained by numbers. So to me, offering options. The idea of circular migration is, to me, great if it's not the only option, that you come and then you go back and that's mandatory and we will enforce it. Depends on the employer, depends on the employee, depends on whether he or she meets a partner, depends on they have children, depends on the needs of the economy. There's so many factors, just like for us. If we want to start working in Qatar, we ask for a 1-year permit, and the next thing you know, you've been there 20 years. Who knows what you need, how your life takes you. And I think that if we put migrants into very closed boxes, that's where we create underground markets. In my country, for example, there's a whole number of temporary migrant worker programs which are limited to 4 years. After 4 years, you need to go back, and you cannot come back to Canada for another 4 years. Now, this rule is being we have changed government, and this rule is being evacuated. But for a long time, and this meant that in Toronto, about 2 years ago, it was the end of the first 4-year period implemented. And Toronto was bracing itself for 75,000 people becoming undocumented from one day to the next. This is policy-driven, and it's a stupid thing to do. When many of these people have jobs, have employers who are happy about them, have integrated over 4 years. You've been there 4 years, you've met people, you have friends, you drink beer like Canadians, etc. So, I mean, you've integrated. Why do you want them to go back? If they want to go back, let them exercise their options. If you want to incentivize them to go back, you can provide them incentives. But don't create conditions that will automatically create undocumentation. This is, to me, shooting oneself in the foot.
They might want to opt to go back if they have a security of the possibility to return.
Exactly. Go back if they lose their job, come back later. I think in terms of development, some ideas that have worked quite well is for example, this was an idea that circulated. If you want nurses, like Britain wants nurses from other countries because they can't, from the Philippines in particular, care workers. Why don't you fund a nursing school in a country of origin? And then you guarantee a job for half the graduates, and you work with the government for them to guarantee a job for the other half in their country. And then you rotate, and you work with this as a tool to increase mobility, to help with your nursing needs, to help with their nursing needs, because you don't want that brain drain idea that there are no nurses in Zimbabwe, which was one of the big issues a number of years ago. You want to create, and you create this by providing options to migrants, not simply taking from them.
Eleni, you have some septic reactions there.
Yeah, I think one very urgent issue also on migration, labor migration, is social security or social protection. This is absent. For example, Filipinos, 80% are in Asia, 60+% are concentrated in the Gulf countries. They don't pay taxes, but then they don't contribute also to any social security. What they get, and they usually work 20, 30 years, what they get is end of service benefits, but then sometimes they're not able to get it. So this is becoming an urgent issue, I don't think only for Filipinos, but for typical migrant workers from Asia. Good thing in Belgium, I think we have a social security agreement. But then our workers are concentrated in places where this is not being offered. And even if you are saying circular migration, it has its pluses and minuses. But then what happens to you when you get suddenly retrenched, you have an accident, whatever? There is nothing where you can get it from.
Yeah. Bogdan, can I ask you to give a second or a third, because the minister already gave two, but give another policy proposal that you feel would be crucial to make migration more a factor of human development?
Well, some of them were given already, like the legal, making it easier to travel, of course. I think one of the important things is to look at the perspective of the people who migrate and not just look in our own interests. I think this is very important. And to make circumstances in the countries better so that people don't feel the need to go to work on the root causes and the push factors is, I think, a very important thing to do. And that is something we do with development, but development aid and cooperation, of course, but it's something we could do with our trade policies, with our climate policies, all those things. We need to use them to tackle, to bring back a better perspective for people living there. And I think for development cooperation, I mean, that's, I think it's important. We are afraid that we are seeing a shift now from using the money from development cooperation just for our own interest. I mean, using the money to keep people away from us. And I think that's a dangerous shift. You see it in a lot of countries, it's happening. For example, the European Development Fund that is being, the EU Emergency Trust Fund, we were supportive of that in the beginning, but now we see that, one, there is not much money, extra money that's going in there. It's money that was already promised that is being used. And second, we see that the projects that are being financed, and I know that the Belgian government has been critical of it, but the projects that are being financed are not projects that are going to give a better perspective to the people who are living there, but are more and more focused on controlling borders, on keeping people away from us. And I think that's a very important thing that from within development cooperation can be shifted and should be tackled. And I think that's a very important thing that we would like to raise in our campaign.
In the emergency fund is the fund that was decided in La Valletta last year?
Yes.
That's
sorry,
the
yes.
EU, African Union
Yes, and
cooperation.
actually Belgium is one of the big contributors to that fund. So it has the power, I think, to weigh politically on it and to shift it in the right direction.
Just one little point. In my visits to neighboring countries to Europe, I've visited detention centers with a big European flag on them. And so, I came back to Brussels and I started asking questions. Why do you fund detention centers? Aren't there more productive investments you can make in the country, etc.? And then I was told, but we're not funding detention centers. And it's true that technically it went through the infrastructure funds that states decided how, I don't know, to use for building detention centers. And then I continued my inquiries and I went to the External Action Service and asked, okay, now there's one part of the money that goes to help integrated border management, detention, etc. What do you fund in those countries to help those countries protect the human rights of migrants on their territory? How do you help, for example, the national human rights institutions or the ombudsperson in order to help them go to the detention center that you've built every month to make a check and see how these people are faring, how they eat, etc.? And there was a blank stare. I was talking to a wall. This was not even in the cards. Now, this was 3 years ago. 3 years ago. I don't know, it may have changed since, but not sure it has. So, again, what's missing is the holistic picture. We want detention centers for criminals in our country. We also want oversight mechanisms that go in those detention centers in order to make reports and to learn from the errors that we're making. That's what we do for ourselves. It should not be different for others.
Maybe we want a reaction from the Minister about how this deal between the EU and the African Union is faring. We talked about the Turkey deal. The African Union deal is much less on the radar, much less politicized. Maybe much less is being done also, but because that is an area that is part of your portfolio, let's say, more than detention centers, which would be a colleague of yours that should be heckled about it.
Whose name we haven't said today.
We wouldn't even...
Your turn.
My turn now. Okay, I think that very often people would say, well, make this link between development cooperation and being supportive of regulating migration flows, and it's easy. It's not that easy. Because first of all, if you look at Belgian development cooperation, if you look at our 14 partner countries, there's not that many of them with whom we have a big migration relationship. So that direct link doesn't exist. And then very often in some of those countries where there might be a link, then how much leverage do you actually have with your budget to say, okay, if you're not behaving the way we want, we will cut your budget. That kind of conditionality, I've never really seen it work. In any place. And then often you would say, well, if you invest in progress of a population, then that will diminish their tendency to migrate. That's not really the case. That's not the case. And in most of the countries where we are active, in the least developed countries, if the living circumstances of people improve, the first reaction will be more migration. So that should not be a reason not to get progress in the least developed countries. Not at all. So it is much more complex than that. But we have indeed, as Bogdan has said, always been very critical of that idea of trying to broker a deal with the African Union, and that part of that deal would be kind of fences to make sure that people don't leave the country. I don't really see how that would work. And indeed, I'd rather see us invest in productive, from a development point of view, infrastructure than investing in some kind of prisons that will never be a solution.
And is anything being done on the development front within that deal? Is it being implemented in a way that you feel would be productive?
It's a big discussion we're having on the European level today, and as Bogdan said, I mean, our voice is quite clear on that, and I think that we Belgians have a quite good understanding in some regions of the world, for example in the Sahel region, on what the mechanism really is. But then we are 28 around the table, and we convince other countries one by one.
Well, there's one leaving, so that's one less too.
Are you sure they're leaving? We'll see.
Eleni, I want to ask you the last question because we're running out of time. But as was said by Bogdan before, we should look at the whole issue from the perspective of migrants. And you're the one in this panel representing migrant workers. What would you say is the crucial issue that should be discussed or implemented? You've got the possibility to do the final and best proposition of this panel.
Wow. Okay. Maybe from the migrant perspective, because we already said it's a fact that they contribute enormously to development of the economies and societies of both countries of origin and destination. But this is at enormous cost as well on the migrants and their families. So I think this is about time that for example, we take the perspective of the migrant. We speak well of the migrants. I think in one of the panel you were saying about how media portrays the migrant workers. So they're not bad guys. They don't take away the jobs. You know, this has been debunked many times for the longest time. So let's speak about those things, that the migrants are contributing. And not only in terms of economics, but also to the origin countries. Because sometimes the people from the countries of destination will look at it as it's draining our resources. But what they contribute to the countries of destination, it would be good to speak well. For example, employers speaking well of how migrants contribute to the work that they are doing, how the domestic workers, the caregivers are contributing to the development in that aspect, in that dimension. And Francois was saying that at the end of the day, migrants will not complain because their main preoccupation is to keep the job out of fear. So we always say when we have dialogues with countries of destination, we say, can you tell the migrants, find ways effectively to convey the message that when they stand up for their rights, when they are in your countries, that the first thing you want to do is to deport. Because that's the first thing that they will imagine, that when they stand up for their rights while they are in Brussels, that they will be deported. So I think, and then this whole issue, we need to popularize what Francois was saying about the firewalls. You know, it's sometimes, it's not as easy as it sounds. But then the firewalls are important because this will guarantee that the other rights of migrants are upheld and respected. So, but sometimes, easier said than done, countries of destination. I put emphasis on the countries of destination because I think it's changing the perspective and changing, it's the same thing, but you change it from the position. I think when you portray the migrants as agents of change, then you are looking at them from the perspective of strength. and not like because you're so poor in your country that you have to come to my country. Yeah, because that has already been the thinking of even young people in the countries of destination. We have to change the narrative. We have to portray a positive image of the migrants, that they are the ones responsible for all this infrastructure and all other things that make the economy continue.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's the basic message. I think it's a...
Last word. This cannot be solved by one country alone. Maybe it's a positive thing that this global compact on migration is coming forward, but at the same time, as Francois said, it could work either way, and that is where we are needed to contribute and to engage. Yeah, it should be able to facilitate mobility, and at the same time should be able to uphold the workers' rights and human rights of the migrants. So international community, solidarity is very crucial as well.
Okay, thank you very much. What I wanted to stress, and I think it's an important takeaway from your last contribution for all of us, is changing the narrative, is trying to talk and think about migration in ways and seeing migrants as agents of change with rights and contributions.
And as persons.
And as human persons with all their complexities that you and I have and that they also have. So I think that is a very important message both to the civil society groups that will campaign as to governments that have to regulate and manage this human reality, to think of it as a human positive contribution for all the rest of us. Does anybody want to have the last comment on that? Or do we take away the wisdom of Elene that she came all the way from the Philippines to deliver that? So thank you very much, all four of you, for this interesting debate.